Picture this. You're a powerful king in ancient Greece, about to make the most important decision of your life. Your kingdom's survival hangs in the balance. Where do you turn for guidance? Not to your advisors, not to your generals, but to a woman sitting on a tripod in a cave, breathing mysterious vapors and speaking in riddles. For nearly 1,000 years, this was the most trusted voice in the ancient world, the Oracle of Delphi. Today, we're diving deep into one of history's most fascinating mysteries. How did a priestess in a remote Greek mountain town become more influential than emperors and kings? What gave her prophecies such incredible power that entire civilizations rose and fell based on her cryptic words? And perhaps, most intriguingly, modern science has uncovered evidence that might finally explain the supernatural phenomena that made her legendary. I'm going to take you on a journey to ancient Delphi, where we'll uncover the secrets of the Pythia, the woman who claimed to speak for Apollo himself. We'll explore the sacred rituals that transformed ordinary women into divine messengers, examine prophecies that changed the course of history, and reveal the shocking scientific discoveries that have revolutionized our understanding of this ancient wonder. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why the Oracle of Delphi wasn't just a religious curiosity. She was the beating heart of ancient Greek civilization. But first, let me paint you a picture of just how powerful this woman really was. When Alexander the Great wanted divine approval for his world conquest, he didn't pray in private. He dragged the oracle out of her chamber by her hair until she gave him the prophecy he wanted. When the wealthy king Croesus contemplated war with Persia, he showered Delphi with gold and silver just for the privilege of hearing her prediction. And when Athens faced annihilation by the Persian Empire, it was the oracle's cryptic words about wooden walls that saved Greek civilization itself. So how did we get here? How did a small sanctuary on the slopes of Mount Parnassus become the center of the ancient world? The story begins in the mists of prehistory, when the site of Delphi was already considered sacred. According to Greek mythology, Zeus released two eagles from opposite ends of the earth, and they met at Delphi, marking it as the center of the world, the omphalos, or navel of the universe. But before Apollo claimed this sacred ground, it belonged to something far more ancient and terrifying. The Greeks told of a massive serpent called Python that guarded this mystical place. Python was no ordinary snake. It was a primordial force of nature, a dragon-like creature that represented the old earth powers. When the young god Apollo arrived, seeking to establish his own sanctuary, he faced this ancient guardian in mortal combat. Apollo's arrows found their mark, piercing Python's massive coils, and the great serpent fell into a deep fissure in the earth. But here's where the story gets truly fascinating. As Python's enormous body rotted in that underground chasm, it began to release strange vapors that rose through cracks in the rock. Anyone who stood over these fissures would suddenly fall into violent trances, seemingly possessed by divine power. The Greeks believed that Apollo himself was speaking through these intoxicated individuals, channeling his divine will through their altered consciousness. This mythological origin story might sound like pure fantasy, but as we'll discover, modern science has found remarkable evidence that suggests these ancient tales contained more truth than anyone imagined. The geological reality beneath Delphi is almost as extraordinary as the myths themselves. Archaeological evidence shows that people have been drawn to this site for over 3,000 years. Mycenaean remains dating back to 1500 BC prove that even Bronze Age civilizations recognized something special about this location. But it wasn't until the 8th century BC that the Oracle of Delphi truly began to emerge as a major force in Greek religion and politics. The transformation happened gradually. As trade networks expanded across the Mediterranean, travelers from distant lands began making pilgrimages to this remote mountain sanctuary. Word spread about the mysterious priestess who could peer into the future and reveal the will of the gods. By the 5th century BC, Delphi had become the most important religious site in all of Greece, and the oracle's influence extended far beyond the boundaries of any single city-state. But who was this oracle? The title Pythia, named after the slain serpent Python, was held by a succession of women who served as Apollo's earthly voice. These weren't just random individuals chosen from the crowd. The Pythia had to meet specific requirements. She must be a native of Delphi, of good character, and live a life of moral purity. While some were married women, once they assumed the sacred role, they abandoned for divine communication. During all family responsibilities and personal identity to become vessels the height of the oracle's power, the Pythia was likely chosen from influential families and was well educated in geography, politics, history, and philosophy. This wasn't just religious theater. It was sophisticated political intelligence gathering and analysis disguised as divine revelation. The oracle operated what we might recognize today as an ancient think tank, collecting information from across the known world and repackaging it as prophetic wisdom. The consultation process itself was an elaborate ritual that could take days or even weeks to complete. Pilgrims would travel from across the Mediterranean world, carrying precious offerings and prepared to pay enormous sums for the privilege of hearing the oracle's words. But you couldn't simply walk up and ask your question. The priests of Apollo controlled access to the Pythia, subjecting potential consultants to intensive interviews to determine the legitimacy of their requests and the proper way to frame their questions. Those deemed worthy faced a series of purification rituals. They had to bathe in the sacred Castalian spring, provide ritual cakes called pelanos, and offer an animal sacrifice that met strict physical standards. Even then, the gods might reject their petition. A goat would be brought before the altar and sprinkled with water. If it shook off the water, the consultation could proceed. If it remained still, the inquirer was turned away, told that Apollo had refused to speak. Only after passing all these tests could a pilgrim finally approach the inner sanctum where the oracle delivered her prophecies. And this is where our story becomes truly extraordinary. The Pythia would descend into a special underground chamber called the adyton, beneath the main temple. There, surrounded by the fumigated smoke of burning laurel leaves and barley meal, she would seat herself on a sacred tripod positioned directly over a deep chasm in the earth. What happened next has puzzled historians and scientists for centuries. According to ancient accounts, mysterious vapors would rise from the crack in the earth, enveloping the Pythia in intoxicating fumes. She would chew laurel leaves, Apollo's sacred plant, and gradually fall into an ecstatic trance. In this altered state, witnesses described her as becoming a different person entirely. Her voice would change, her body would convulse, and she would begin speaking in ways that seemed utterly alien to her normal personality. The words that poured forth from the entranced Pythia were rarely clear or straightforward. Ancient sources describe utterances that ranged from coherent verse to incomprehensible babbling. Sometimes she spoke in perfect poetic meter, delivering elaborate prophecies that could be interpreted multiple ways. Other times, she would shriek and moan in apparent agony, forcing the attending priests to decipher meaning from her tortured sounds. This brings us to one of the most crucial aspects of the Delphic oracle system, the role of interpretation. The priests didn't simply record whatever the Pythia said and hand it over to the consultant. Instead, they served as divine translators, taking her raw, prophetic utterances and crafting them into the famously ambiguous responses that made Delphi legendary. These weren't random riddles. They were carefully constructed statements that could technically be fulfilled regardless of how events unfolded, while still providing enough guidance to be genuinely useful. This masterful ambiguity wasn't accidental. It was the oracle's greatest strength. Consider the most famous prophecy in ancient history, one that perfectly demonstrates the oracle's genius for strategic vagueness. King Croesus of Lydia, legendary for his immense wealth, found himself facing a growing threat from the expanding Persian Empire. Cyrus the Great's armies were pressing against Lydia's borders, and Croesus knew he had to act. But should he strike first, or wait for the Persians to make their move? Desperate for divine guidance, Croesus spared no expense. He sent lavish gifts to Delphi, gold, silver, precious artifacts worth a king's ransom. When he finally stood before the oracle, his question was direct. Should he go to war with Persia? The Pythia's response would echo through history. If you make war on the Persians, you will destroy a great empire. Croesus was ecstatic. Here was divine confirmation of what he hoped to hear, that his armies would crush the Persian threat and destroy their great empire. He gathered his forces, crossed into Persian territory, and launched his attack. But the oracle's words proved cruelly prophetic. Croesus did indeed destroy a great empire, his own. The Persians defeated the Lydian army, captured Croesus himself, and absorbed his kingdom into their growing dominion. This wasn't a failed prophecy. It was a masterpiece of strategic communication. The oracle had given an answer that was technically correct regardless of the outcome, while allowing Croesus to interpret it according to his own desires and assumptions. Whether he won or lost, the oracle would be vindicated. This kind of brilliant double meaning made Delphi's reputation unassailable and kept pilgrims coming back for more. But the oracle's influence extended far beyond individual consultations. Her pronouncements shaped the political landscape of the entire Greek world. When city-states founded new colonies, they sought the oracle's blessing for their locations. When they considered changing their laws, they asked for divine approval. When they faced military threats, they turned to Delphi for strategic guidance disguised as religious prophecy. Perhaps no prophecy had greater historical impact than the oracle's cryptic warning to Athens during the Persian Wars. In 480 BC, the massive Persian army under Xerxes was bearing down on Greece, having already crushed Spartan resistance at Thermopylae. Athens faced complete annihilation. Their city would surely be burned, their people enslaved or slaughtered. In desperation, Athenian envoys rushed to Delphi seeking any hope for survival. The oracle's initial response was utterly terrifying. Flee to the ends of the earth, for fire and war will destroy everything. But when the Athenians pleaded for another consultation, the Pythia offered a second prophecy that contained a glimmer of hope. Far-seeing Zeus grants that the wooden wall only shall not fall, but help you and your children. What did this mean? Athenian leaders were divided. Some interpreted the wooden wall literally, perhaps referring to the ancient wooden palisade that once protected the Acropolis. They argued for barricading themselves on the sacred hill and waiting out the siege, but one man saw deeper meaning in the oracle's words. Themistocles, the brilliant Athenian general and politician, argued that the wooden wall referred to something else entirely: Athens' fleet of wooden warships. This interpretation would prove to be one of the most consequential acts of prophecy analysis in human history. Instead of cowering behind walls, Themistocles convinced the Athenians to evacuate their city and trust everything to their navy. When the Persian fleet met the Greek ships in the narrow straits of Salamis, the wooden walls of Athens' trireme warships did indeed prove impregnable. The Greeks won a crushing victory that turned the tide of the entire war, saving not just Athens but the future of Greek civilization itself. Was this divine intervention or brilliant political analysis disguised as religious prophecy? The answer might be both. The oracle's priests maintained extensive networks of informants throughout the Mediterranean world. They knew about military movements, political alliances, economic conditions, and social tensions across dozens of city-states and kingdoms. When they crafted their prophetic responses, they weren't just making random predictions. They were synthesizing vast amounts of intelligence into strategic advice. The oracle's power reached its absolute peak during the classical period, when no major decision was made anywhere in the Greek world without consulting Delphi first. Kings and commoners alike made the difficult journey up Mount Parnassus, bringing offerings and seeking wisdom from Apollo's voice. The sanctuary became incredibly wealthy, its treasuries filled with gold and silver donated by grateful rulers whose empires had prospered following the oracle's guidance. But this immense influence came with risks. Different city-states began competing for control over Delphi, recognizing that whoever dominated the oracle could shape the political destiny of all Greece. The so-called sacred wars were fought specifically over control of this holy site, with various alliances rising and falling based on their relationship to the priestess and her prophecies. Even as Greek power waned and new empires rose to dominate the Mediterranean, rulers continued to seek the oracle's blessing. Roman generals and emperors made pilgrimages to Delphi, hoping to secure divine approval for their conquests. The oracle proved remarkably adaptable, offering prophecies that served the interests of whoever held political power, while maintaining her sacred authority. Yet beneath all the political maneuvering and religious theater, something genuinely mysterious was happening in that underground chamber. Ancient writers consistently described phenomena that seemed to go beyond mere performance or fraud. Plutarch, who served as a priest at Delphi in the 1st century AD, wrote detailed accounts of the Pythia's trances that suggest something real and extraordinary was taking place. According to these eyewitness accounts, the oracle would sometimes enter states so violent and disturbing that she would emerge physically injured, her body bearing the marks of whatever spiritual forces had possessed her. Other times, the vapors rising from the earth seemed weaker, and the Pythia would struggle to achieve the proper level of divine inspiration. These weren't the descriptions of a calculated performance. They suggested genuine altered states of consciousness that neither the priestess nor her attendants could fully control. For centuries, scholars dismissed these accounts as superstition or exaggeration. The vapors described by ancient sources were nowhere to be found when archaeologists excavated the site. The oracle's trances seemed like nothing more than elaborate theater designed to impress gullible pilgrims. But then, in the late 20th century, modern science made a discovery that changed everything. A team of researchers led by geologist Gel de Boer made a startling finding beneath the ruins of Apollo's temple. Using advanced geological surveys, they discovered something the ancient sources had described, but modern scholars had dismissed: active fault lines running directly beneath the spot where the oracle delivered her prophecy's activity that could release gases through cracks in the rock. Even more remarkably, the limestone geological evidence was undeniable. 2 major fault lines, Inter's bedrock beneath Delphi, contained hydrocarbon deposits laid down millions of years ago when they acted directly beneath the ancient temple, creating precisely the kind of underground this region lay beneath ancient seas. When the earth shifted along these fault lines, the friction and pressure would heat the surrounding rock, vaporizing the lighter petrochemicals trapped within the limestone. These gases would then rise through the fractured stone, eventually emerging through fissures in the temple floor, exactly where ancient sources described the mysterious vapors that induced the Pythia's trances. But what kind of gases were these? Chemical analysis of spring water and mineral deposits around the site revealed the presence of several intoxicating compounds. The most significant was ethylene, a sweet-smelling gas that produces exactly the kind of euphoric, dissociative effects described in ancient accounts of the oracle's altered states. Modern medicine knows ethylene well. It was widely used as an anesthetic in the early 20th century before being replaced by safer alternatives. Patients who inhaled ethylene reported feelings of floating, out-of-body experiences, and a peculiar sense of divine connection. They would often speak in altered voices and display personality changes remarkably similar to what ancient witnesses described when watching the Pythia channel Apollo's voice. The implications are staggering. For nearly 2,000 years, scholars assumed the oracle's trances were either complete fabrication or primitive psychological manipulation. But the geological evidence suggests something far more extraordinary: that the ancient Greeks had accidentally discovered one of the most powerful naturally occurring psychoactive sites on Earth. Picture the scene. A woman sits on a tripod positioned directly over active gas vents, breathing concentrated ethylene mixed with other hydrocarbon vapors in an enclosed underground chamber. The stone walls would trap and concentrate these intoxicating fumes, creating an environment where altered consciousness was not just possible but inevitable. Add the psychological pressure of performing before powerful rulers, the ritual elements of laurel leaves and sacred smoke, and the intense expectation that divine possession should occur, and you have all the ingredients for profound mystical experiences. Yet this scientific explanation raises as many questions as it answers. If the oracle's power came from naturally occurring gas emissions, why didn't every culture that encountered similar geological formations develop identical oracular traditions? What made the Greeks uniquely capable of transforming a geological accident into the most influential religious institution of the ancient world? The answer lies in the sophisticated system the Greeks built around their geological discovery. The oracle wasn't just a woman breathing gas. She was the centerpiece of an elaborate intelligence network that spanned the entire Mediterranean world. The priests of Apollo weren't merely religious functionaries by turn. They were skilled political analysts who could interpret the Pythia's drug-induced utterances in ways that provided genuine strategic value to their clients. Consider how the consultation process actually worked. Pilgrims didn't just show up and ask random questions. They underwent extensive preliminary interviews, where the priests would extract detailed information about their political situations, military concerns, economic challenges, and personal dilemmas. These weren't just religious formalities, they were sophisticated intelligence-gathering sessions. By the time a consultant finally stood before the oracle, the priests already knew everything they needed to craft a response that would appear divinely inspired while actually being based on careful analysis of real-world conditions. The Pythia's gas-induced trance provided the perfect delivery mechanism. The altered state gave weight and mystery to advice that was actually grounded in practical political intelligence. This system reached its peak sophistication during the 6th and 5th centuries BC, when Delphi operated what amounted to the ancient world's first international think tank. Information flowed into the sanctuary from across the known world. Merchants reported on economic conditions. Travelers brought news of political developments, and diplomatic envoys shared intelligence about military movements and alliance negotiations. The oracle's priests synthesized this vast stream of information, identified patterns and trends that individual rulers might miss, and then packaged their analysis as divine prophecy. When they told King Croesus that attacking Persia would destroy a great empire, they weren't making a supernatural prediction. They were offering a sophisticated geopolitical assessment based on their understanding of Persian military capabilities and Lydian vulnerabilities. The genius of the system lay in its perfect fusion of genuine mystical experience with practical political analysis. The Pythia's ethylene-induced trances weren't fake. Ancient witnesses described real and dramatic alterations in consciousness that convinced even skeptical observers that something supernatural was occurring. But the content of her prophecies wasn't random divine inspiration, for it was carefully crafted strategic advice delivered through the medium of religious theater. This combination made the oracle uniquely powerful because it satisfied both the spiritual and practical needs of ancient leaders. Rulers genuinely believed they were receiving messages from the gods, which gave them the confidence to make difficult decisions. But they were also receiving advice based on the best available intelligence analysis, which meant their God-inspired choices often led to successful outcomes. The oracle's influence extended far beyond individual consultations into the fundamental structures of Greek civilization. When new colonies were established, Delphi's approval legitimized the venture and helped coordinate settlement efforts across multiple city-states. When legal reforms were proposed, the oracle's blessing provided the religious authority needed to overcome conservative resistance. When military alliances were forged, divine sanction from Apollo helped bind together otherwise fractious Greek communities. The sacred calendar, centered on Delphi, shaped the rhythm of political and economic life throughout the Greek world. The oracle only gave consultations on specific days, primarily the 7th day of each month, which was sacred to Apollo. This restriction forced rulers to plan their most important decisions around Delphi's schedule, effectively synchronizing political activity across dozens of independent city-states. During the 3 winter months, when Apollo was believed to visit the mysterious northern land of the Hyperboreans, the oracle fell silent entirely. This seasonal pause created natural cycles of political activity, with major military campaigns and diplomatic initiatives typically launched after the spring resumption of prophetic services. The god Dionysus took over the sanctuary during Apollo's absence, transforming Delphi into a center for very different kinds of religious experiences involving wine, ecstasy, and theatrical performance. The oracle's economic impact was equally profound. The sanctuary accumulated enormous wealth through donations from grateful rulers, and this treasure was reinvested throughout the Greek world in the form of public works projects, artistic commissions, and loans to cities facing financial difficulties. Delphi functioned as an ancient central bank, with the oracle's priests managing vast financial resources that could stabilize or destabilize entire regions. The Pythia herself occupied a unique position in ancient society, a woman wielding political influence that exceeded that of most male rulers. For nearly 1,000 years, the most important decisions in the Mediterranean world were shaped by the words of successive priestesses who claimed to speak for Apollo. This female authority existed within an otherwise intensely patriarchal culture, creating fascinating tensions and contradictions. Different women brought different styles and capabilities to the role. During the oracle's golden age, the Pythia was often chosen from educated aristocratic families. Women who possessed the cultural knowledge and political sophistication needed to understand complex international situations. Their prophecies reflected this expertise, displaying nuanced understanding of military strategy, economic principles, and diplomatic protocol. As Greek power waned and the Roman Empire expanded, the quality of oracular pronouncements began to decline. Later, Pythias were often selected from humble backgrounds, lacking the broad education that had made their predecessors so effective. Their prophecies became simpler and more generic, relying on traditional formulas rather than sophisticated analysis of contemporary events. The Romans initially showed great respect for the oracle, with emperors like Augustus and Hadrian making elaborate pilgrimages to Delphi and showering the sanctuary with gifts. But other Roman leaders proved more skeptical or exploitative. Nero allegedly murdered a Pythia who refused to give him the prophecy he wanted, while various generals plundered Delphi's treasures to fund their military campaigns. The oracle's decline accelerated as Christianity gained influence throughout the Roman Empire. Christian writers attacked the Pythia as a fraud, or, even worse, as a conduit for demonic forces. The Emperor Constantine, after his conversion to Christianity, began restricting traditional religious practices and redirecting imperial patronage toward Christian institutions. The final blow came in the late 4th century AD, when Emperor Theodosius I issued comprehensive laws banning pagan religious activities throughout the empire. The last recorded prophecy from Delphi reportedly came around 393 AD, when the oracle herself may have predicted the end of her own tradition. According to some accounts, her final utterance was a lament for the silencing of Apollo's voice and the coming darkness of religious ignorance. With the oracle's suppression, one of humanity's longest-running institutions came to an end. For over 8 centuries, the Pythia had shaped the destiny of civilizations, guided the decisions of kings, and provided a spiritual focal point for the entire Greek-speaking world. Her influence extended far beyond religion into politics, economics, military strategy, and cultural development. The legacy of the Oracle of Delphi reaches far beyond the ancient world. The concept of seeking divine guidance for important decisions became deeply embedded in Western culture, influencing everything from medieval Christian mysticism to modern political rhetoric about moral authority and divine mandate. The oracle's model of combining spiritual authority with practical intelligence has been replicated by religious and political leaders throughout history. Even the oracle's famous ambiguity left its mark on human communication. The art of crafting statements that can be interpreted multiple ways while maintaining plausible accuracy became a fundamental skill in diplomacy, politics, and public relations. Modern politicians and business leaders still employ Delphic language when they need to appear decisive while keeping their options open. The recent geological discoveries at Delphi have profound implications for our understanding of consciousness, spirituality, and the relationship between physical and psychological phenomena. If the oracle's powers stemmed from naturally occurring psychoactive gases, what does this tell us about other mystical traditions that may have developed around similar geological features? Scientists have begun investigating whether other ancient oracular sites might also be located over natural gas emissions. The Oracle of Trophonius at Lydia, another Greek divination center famous for its underground chambers and altered state experiences, sits in a region with similar geological characteristics to Delphi. The mysteries of Eleusis, which promised initiates profound spiritual revelations, may also have involved naturally occurring psychoactive substances. These findings force us to reconsider the entire relationship between spirituality and neuroscience. Rather than dismissing ancient religious experiences as primitive superstition, we might need to recognize that our ancestors accidentally discovered powerful tools for altering consciousness that modern science is only beginning to understand. The Oracle of Delphi represents something unprecedented in human history, a successful fusion of mystical experience, practical intelligence, and political authority that lasted for nearly a millennium. Her story challenges our assumptions about the relationship between religion and politics, between ancient and modern forms of knowledge, and between the spiritual and material dimensions of human experience. In our next section, we'll explore the specific mechanics of how consultations actually worked, examine more of the oracle's most famous prophecies in detail, and discover what happened to the women who served as the Pythia when their sacred duties finally came to an end. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the oracle's decline wasn't its political suppression, it was the gradual weakening of the geological phenomena that had powered it for centuries. Modern scientists studying the fault lines beneath Delphi have discovered that gas emissions from underground sources naturally diminish over time as the hydrocarbon deposits are depleted and the rock fractures shift and seal. Ancient sources from the later Roman period describe exactly this phenomena. Plutarch, writing in the 1st century AD when he served as a priest at the temple, noted that the sacred vapors had become much weaker and more intermittent than in earlier times. The Pythia would sometimes struggle for hours to achieve the proper trance state, and her prophecies became less dramatic and more mundane. What the ancients interpreted as the gods withdrawing their favor was actually the earth itself running out of the natural chemicals that had created the oracle's power. This gradual geological exhaustion helps explain why the oracle's influence waned long before Christianity delivered the final blow. By the time Theodosius banned pagan practices, Delphi had already lost much of its mystical potency. The woman who delivered that final prophecy in 393 AD may have been breathing nothing more than ordinary air, her words carrying authority only through centuries of accumulated tradition, rather than any chemically induced altered state. Yet the oracle's impact on human consciousness extends far beyond her specific historical moment. The thousands of women who served as Pythia over the centuries underwent experiences that modern neuroscience is only beginning to understand. Recent research into psychoactive substances and altered states of consciousness suggests that the oracle's ethylene-induced trances may have provided access to types of mental processing that our normal waking consciousness cannot achieve. Contemporary studies of similar dissociative states show that subjects often display enhanced pattern recognition, increased access to unconscious knowledge, and an unusual ability to synthesize complex information in novel ways. The Pythia's prophecies may have emerged from a genuinely heightened form of consciousness that allowed her to perceive connections and possibilities that escaped ordinary analysis. This raises profound questions about the nature of intuition, wisdom, and decision-making. Were the oracle's insights simply the product of sophisticated intelligence gathering combined with drug-induced confidence? Or did her altered states actually provide access to forms of knowledge that transcend normal rational thought? The answer may be both. The ethylene didn't create wisdom from nothing, but it may have unlocked cognitive abilities that already existed within the human mind. The implications extend to our modern understanding of leadership and guidance. In our data-driven age, we often might be value in approaches that combine rig information, but the oracle's success suggests that they assume that the best decisions come from purely rational analysis of available intelligence gathering with more intuitive, non-rational forms of insight. The most effective leaders throughout history have often been those who could synthesize vast amounts of information while also trusting their instincts about patterns and possibilities that couldn't be fully explained. The oracle's consultation process also reveals sophisticated insights about the psychology of decision-making. The elaborate rituals, expensive offerings, and lengthy waiting periods weren't just religious theater. They served important psychological functions. By the time consultants finally stood before the Pythia, they had invested enormous time, effort, and resources in the process. This investment created powerful psychological commitment to taking the oracle's advice seriously and following through on difficult decisions. So there you have it, the incredible true story of the Oracle of Delphi, where ancient wisdom met geological accident to create the most influential voice in the classical world. For nearly 1,000 years, the Pythia bridged the gap between divine mystery and political reality, using naturally occurring psychoactive gases and sophisticated intelligence networks to guide the destiny of civilizations. Her legacy reminds us that the most powerful insights often emerge from the unexpected fusion of spiritual experience and practical knowledge, challenging our modern assumptions about consciousness, authority, and the very nature of wisdom itself.